Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click on that bell notification. That way, when we're doing our thing, YouTube lets you know. Today, we finish my top 100 board games of all time, breaking into the top 10 ever. These are the 10 greatest games I have ever played. Without any further ado, let's get straight to it with my number 10, The Castles of Burgundy, designed by Steppenfeld and published by Ravensburger Games. This game was on my list last year. It was ranked number 10, one of the few games, I think it's the only game actually, on this list that remain in the same exact spot from year to year, and a pretty high spot at that, number 10. This game is a wonderful game by Steppenfeld. This is probably his most popular game. It's his highest ranked game on BoardGameGeek.com. So again, it's very well received by the Board Game Geek audience. Now, there has recently been a new edition, a prettied up deluxe edition. It's not a 10th anniversary edition. It has not been 10 years. It's definitely not a 20th anniversary, as I've heard some people mention. This game is about 8 or 9 years old, but it is still such a classic. Now, I will admit, this original publishing here is not the most beautiful of designs. You have some boards that are pretty flimsy. The color schemes are pretty plain and boring, to say the least, right? But mechanically speaking, it's such a sound game. Each turn, players are rolling their color-coded dice, and these dice basically give them their actions, right? You're rolling 2 dice, so you have 2 actions you could take on each turn, and you can use those pips that you roll on those dice to activate certain things. You can either use them to draft certain tiles from the depots on the main player board in order to add them to your personal player board, and you can use those same pips in order to place those already previously acquired tiles onto your hexagonal grid of a player board, which is basically referred to as your estate, right? It's basically a city building game, and you're building farmlands with animals and castles, and you're building ports here, seaports here, and you have cities with different buildings that grant you special abilities at the moment that you play them. You also have the yellow tiles, which represent your knowledge, which is kind of like your technology. It's different things that give you permanent benefits and abilities going forward, or maybe they help you score points in a certain specific way at the end of the game. And this is definitely a point salad, what Steppenfeld is famous for. So many different ways of collectively working on picking up points. You're racing towards completing certain sets so you can get extra points over and above your opponents. Really fun, plays well at 2, plays well at 3 and 4. Awesome game. My number 10 board game of all time, Castles of Burgundy. And now we move on to my number 9. And my number 9 was also on the list last year. It was actually ranked number 4, so it's gone down a bit. And that is Le Havre, designed by Uwe Rosenberg and published by Lookout Games. This is an amazing game. I have so much fun playing this game with my wife. It's Uwe Rosenberg, it's worker placement, it's resource management, it's resource conversion, because you're running this port and you are building your portion of Le Havre with all of these different buildings represented by cards that serve as worker placement spots that you can use in the future. So you have some of these buildings, your opponents have some of these buildings, and the city itself has some neutral buildings that are available to all players. And sometimes when you want to go to these neutral buildings or to your opponent's buildings, you need to pay either food or money in order to activate those actions. And money is such an important currency in the game because you're using it as an alternative for food, because yes, you do have to feed your people, as is known with many Uwe Rosenberg games. At the end of each round, you need to feed your people. But the money is also your victory condition, because at the end of the game, your points is a total of your coinage plus the value of all the ships and buildings that you've built throughout the game. And there are so many resources. I keep them in these nice little trays here. So many resources. For example, you've got cattle here, and each of these are represented by these tiles that are double-sided, and the opposite side shows an upgraded version of that resource. For example, this is meat. And what happens is you're using these buildings to acquire resources. You're using these buildings to convert your resources into another resource, or possibly into an upgraded version of itself, in order to optimize your decisions and your options. And Furthermore, you're just using all these things in order to collect food to feed your people by the end of each round, and also to gather as many of those points as possible. There's so many different options you can pursue, so many different routes, so many different strategies you can implement. It's really cool because each round is a collective 7 turns for all of the players. So what's interesting is that it's an odd number. So no matter how many players are playing, one player is going to have one more turn in that round than anybody else. But it's going to alternate. So throughout the game, everybody's going to have an equal amount of turns. But in each given round, one player is going to have a slight advantage, or maybe even more depending on the player count, or is going to have a slight advantage as far as the options are concerned, the turns. So you got to factor that in going into the round. You have to know how many turns do I have, what can I do, and what will I do in order to make sure to, yes, execute everything efficiently and get the best I can, the best bang for my buck, but at the same time make sure that I have food waiting for me at the end of the round in order to feed my people. Really cool game. My number 9 board game of all time, Le Havre. And now we move on to my number 8, and this game was also in my top 10 last year. So far we're starting off with a bunch of games that were in my list, and in particular my top 10 last year. And this game was ranked number 7. It's gone down slightly just to number 8. My number 8 board game of all time is Power Grid, designed by Freedom and Freeze and published by Rio Grande Games. And one of the things that all 3 of these games have in common is that they're all ranked in the top 50 on BoardGameGeek.com for a good reason. These are evergreen games that are all around 10 years or older. In the case of Power Grid, it's over 15 years old. So this has been around for a while. I think the original German version is actually 20 years old at this point. So this is a fun game with lots of a combination of lots of different mechanisms. You have basically route network building, where you're establishing your network of power plants or cities that you are supplying power to. And that's part of the game. But you're also building your power plants, which are your sources of energy for you to supply power to those cities. But the way you acquire those power plants is through an auction at the beginning of each turn. And manipulating that auction is so intricate and so neat. Furthermore, you have this resource track, which is a supply and demand resource track. And there's 4 different resources in the game. You have uranium, you have garbage, you have coal, and you have oil. And these are your 4 different resources, and your power plants specifically tell you what resource you need in order to supply the power, how many cities they supply power for, and how much resources of that given type can you store at a time, right? Because you do have a capacity. And finding the balance of the storage plus manipulating that supply and demand resource market to your advantage is really the crux of the game. Because if you find yourself doing that, you're going to increase your chances of winning. Because throughout the game, you're supplying power to these cities, and the more cities you supply power to, the more money you get, which is great because the money allows you to buy power plants, it allows you to buy those resources, and it allows you to buy more cities to expand your network of cities throughout the map. But the money is not the end game condition. That's not how you win the game. You win the game by triggering, first of all, the end game by becoming the first player to have built a certain threshold of cities. I think 17 for a multiplayer game. And once you've triggered that end game, everybody, that's the last round for everybody. And whoever can supply the most power or the power to the most cities on that given round is the winner. So it doesn't matter if you have the most cities. It doesn't matter if you have the most power plants. It's that common denominator. I have 17 cities, but I have enough power plants and or resources to supply power to 15 of them, but nobody else can even pass that. So I win the game. And again, managing that resource market to your advantage, and also having a good sense of control of the resources you have available for your different power plants and their capacity. Again, that is the heart, the bread and butter of this game. So cool, so intricate, a little bit long, but always an enjoyable experience in our household. My number 8 board game of all time, Power Grid. My number 7 board game of all time, again, part of my list last year, and that was, it ranked at number 3. So it's gone down a few spots, and that is Agricola, designed by Uwe Rosenberg, and this edition here by Mayfair Games. This is a classic worker placement game with a farm theme, right? And Uwe Rosenberg has published a lot of these big, heavy, robust worker placement style games with a agricultural theme pasted onto it, and this is probably the first in that regard. He did have Bonanza and a couple other agricultural themed games that were card games or different types of games, but this is the first of the worker placement games. And this is such a fun game. First of all, there's so much going on in this game. You're starting the game with a certain amount of worker placement spots available. And as the game progresses, you have one additional worker placement spot made available to you each round for the next 14 rounds of the game. And there's so many things you're trying to do. You're trying to grow your family, because as you expand your family, you start with just two workers, 2 family members, and you're expanding and growing your family, you're having children, in order to work your way up all the way to 5 workers, and that's going to give you more options going forward. It's also going to give you more mouths to feed, because this was the start of Uwe's Feed Your People games. At the end of each round, you need to feed a certain amount of food for each family member. So it's a little bit of give and take. You do want those additional workers to have more options, but again, that's more mouths to feed. So it's a little bit more stress in that regard. Now you're expanding, but you cannot grow your family unless you grow your household. Your household starts with just 2 rooms, and you need to have capacity, 1 room per each family member, in order to grow your family. So you're also trying to build your home, but you're also participating in the raising of crops. You're planting grain to grow and make bread. You're planting veggies to grow and all that stuff. And these will also serve for your supply of food, but they're also going to be victory points at the end of the game if you can have a certain amount in your supply. You're also doing some animal husbandry. You're raising cows, and you're raising pigs, and you're raising sheep. And as you have pairs of them, you can breed at the end of each harvest round, right? And that's all well and good. But at the same time, you need to have capacity to place these sheep, right? You need to build pastures in order to accommodate them. You need to add stables in order to maximize your pastures. And you need to figure all these things out. Now, throughout the game, you're also acquiring major improvements that help you convert your animals into food and upgrade and optimize how you can turn your grain into food and what have you. You're also playing with these set of cards at the beginning of each game. You get a certain amount, depending on the variant you choose. You get a certain amount of these minor improvement cards and a certain amount of these occupation cards plans. Now, one of the things that people have about Agricola is that they feel that it pigeonholes them into a specific way of playing the game, because you have to have a little bit of everything, or else you do lose some points at the end of the game. Also, feeding your people. If you don't feed your people, you lose. You get beggar tokens, and they're -3 points. So if you get too many of those, forget about it. And there is some truth to that, but at the same time, you can still focus on 2 or 3 areas and specialize in some areas and neglect some other areas to some extent. If you neglect them altogether, then yes, you probably will suffer the consequences. And yes, there's a cap in Agricola. You can't just go all crazy on sheep and reap a bunch of points. You can only gain like 4 points at a certain threshold of sheep. And after that, gaining any other sheep is useless to you. So there is that. But again, it's a fine-tuned, stingy game. But if you like that kind of stingy game and trying to accept and embrace the challenge of milking it for what it's worth and getting the most out of it, it's a really cool game. Again, fun, thematically speaking as well. My number 7 board game of all time, Agricola. Now we move on to my number 6. And it's the first new game to the list this year. And that is Ora Labora. And I should say it's the first new one in this top 10, I might mention. And this is also designed by Uwe Rosenberg, and it's also a worker placement agricultural theme game. But here, instead of being a family of farmers, you are a group of monks, and you have 3 workers, and you only have 3 workers from each round. But there's so many neat things that this game has. First of all, it copies the resource conversion mechanism from Le Havre, because you have all of these resources and they are double-sided because you can convert them into upgraded versions of themselves. It copies these buildings represented by cards that Agricola had. I should say that Le Havre had. So you have all of these cards here, and they represent your buildings that you can place your workers to activate worker placement actions. Really, really cool. And there's even more resources than there are in Le Havre as far as that's concerned. But some really neat things that this game has is, again, you have your 3 workers. And the cool thing about your workers are that your workers, you have one worker in particular that looks like this, who is your prior. And he is a little bit different than the other monks, because your prior allows you, as soon as you purchase a building and add it to your player area, you can place your prior down and activate that power. Because normally when you build a building, you're gonna have to wait till a future turn in order to place a worker there and activate it. Now, another cool thing is that you do not just pick up your workers at the end of each round. No, your workers stay there until all 3 have been placed. Then you collect them all back. So it might take 2, maybe even 3 rounds to have placed all 3 of your workers and then collect them all back, right? So you don't have all 3 of them available to you at a given point. But you could also pay your opponents a certain money, depending on how many players are playing and what version and difficulty you're playing. You pay them a certain currency, and if you pay them, you can use one of their workers on one of their worker placement spots if that worker is available. So that part is really neat as well. You also have this cool resource dial, and it is so cool because as the round progresses, you rotate this clockwise, and first of all, this kind of signifies the progression of the game, and it triggers 4 or 5 different points in the game where you can add special building cards to your player area. But also, as you rotate the dial, it will also alter the amount of resources of each given resource that are available, because you have these wooden tokens that you will place on the board to represent all the resources that you'll be acquiring through these tiles. And as you rotate, it'll tell you that there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 if you choose to produce those given resources on that turn. So manipulating this dial and interacting with it, it's such a cool thing. Also, a really cool thing about this game is players start with their main player board, and their main player board starts with a few worker placement actions available. It also starts with some woods and other spots that you can use to remove certain cards and produce certain resources at that point. But also, when you remove these cards, you create further slots in which you can place these buildings that you buy and place them on there. And what's really cool about this game is that as the game progresses, you're buying these expansion boards that expand your board, your player board. They either expand it upward or downward, or you could even place coastlands on the side to it, or mountainous regions on the other side of it. And these create specific spots, additional spots that you can place these buildings, but also these buildings quite often require specific terrain types in which you can place them, right? You can't just place them willy-nilly. So that puzzle, that challenge of figuring out how to expand your player board based on the building cards that you're interested in acquiring is all really, really neat. And even the buildings themselves and the way they score you is so intricate, because these buildings, some of them score you straight up in certain ways, but others score you based on the buildings that are adjacent to them. So even the spatial decision of figuring out where you're going to place these tiles, you don't just place them down wherever you so please, you place them down where you think they're going to be most helpful to you. And figuring that all out is really such a neat challenge, at least as far as I'm concerned. I just fell in love with this game. It totally eclipsed Agricola, which I really, really do love. And the one negative thing about this game is that it is a little bit long. But if you don't mind a long, meaty, heavy Euro, my number 6 board game of all time, Ora Labora. Now we move on to my number 5. We're in the top 5, and my number 5 is Robinson Crusoe, designed by Ignacy Trzewiczek and published by Portal Games. And this is another new game to my list, all the way in the top 5. This is a cooperative board game where players are working together to deal with different scenarios, which all kind of revolve around being castaways in an island, and you're working collectively to produce resources, to create shelter, to, you know, protect yourself from the elements, from the rain and the winter, to create palisades to protect you from the wildlife. But at the same time, every once in a while, you want to go hunting that same wildlife for fur, for food, and other additional resources. You're creating all these decisions throughout the game, and you're using some worker placement, cooperatively speaking, albeit, worker placement mechanisms in order to activate these actions. And the really cool thing about the worker placement is that usually the way the worker placement works is you can place one of your workers, and each character, each player has 2 workers. You can place one of your workers in order to risk taking an action, roll some dice and see if you succeed at said action. Or you can place 2 of your workers, be a little bit less efficient that given round, but at the same time assure yourself the guaranteed success of that specific action. So again, it's all about what you want to do. And you can play with a Friday and a dog additional character, which allows you a few more worker placement pieces in order to manipulate and make your decisions. Really, really cool. I love the thematic feel of the game. I really do feel like we're striving just to survive and hopefully accomplish whatever it is that our mission is. I also like the fact that each player does have a character that's very, very unique and grants them very unique abilities, and you're manipulating this resource, these determination tokens throughout the game that are very helpful, because without these determination tokens, you can't even really use your special powers. And I find that to be really neat, because quite often player powers are taken for granted in board games. But in this case, yes, you do have those player powers and they're available to you in theory, but if you don't do your part throughout the game to accrue these determination tokens, then you know what? You're just as good as the next person. You need those determination tokens in order to make yourself stand out as a player. Really cool game. My number 5 board game of all time, Robinson Crusoe. And now we move on to my number 4 board game of all time. And this game is also new to the list. So after a series of repeats, we have a series of new games this year. And that is Kingsburg, designed by Andrea Charvesio and Luca Iannacco, and published by Z-Man Games. And this is a second edition of this game. People differ as to which one they prefer graphic design. I don't really care. I think they both are nice looking, and I'm totally satisfied with this one. This is a worker placement, dice placement game. Your workers are dice, and you're rolling these dice, and then based on the numbers you roll, you're placing them on the player boards. And the player board, the worker placement spots, consists basically of all these different royal court officials with different ranks and different benefits that you get. And basically, for the most part, what they get you is either one of the 3 resources or a combination of them in the game. You got gold, you got stone, and you got wood. Or they allow you to increase your military, which is very important, because at the end of each round, you have a winter season and you have some hordes of fantastical creatures invading your land and causing you damage. And if you don't have a strong enough army, you will not be able to withstand their onslaught. So you got to factor that in. And it's really cool because you're using these 3 resources, gold, wood, and stone, in order to build your buildings. This is a city building game, and you're building the buildings here on this player board here. And it's so cool because these buildings, not only do they grant you victory points, but they grant you special abilities going forward. Sometimes they help you with your military or your army, or sometimes they help you in the production of different resources, or even in the manipulation of the dice rolling, because again, this is a dice placement game. You're rolling these dice, so in order to have some mitigation of that luck of that dice rolling, some of these buildings help you with that. Now, the really cool thing about this city building here is that it's a challenge. Again, there's a spatial element to it, because again, you don't just build these buildings as you so please. You need to build them in order from left to right. So in order to build a 3rd or 4th building on any given row here, then you're gonna have to work your way from left to right on the columns in order to get to those buildings. So mapping this all out, because you're not going to get to build all these buildings, but mapping it all out as you strategize early on the game and figure out where you're heading to is such a neat part of this game. Really fun, always have a good time. I don't know why I'm enjoying this lighter worker placement game so much more than I'm enjoying some of the heavier worker placement games. That part actually surprises me, but there's just something about this game that is so pleasing and satisfying to me as I play it. I also feel that at a 2-player count, it actually plays pretty quickly. Really cool. My number 4 board game of all time, Kingsburg. My number 3 board game of all time was on the list last year. As a matter of fact, going forward, all of these games have been on the list before. My number 3 board game was ranked number 6 last year. So even within the top 10, it's actually climbed up a few spots. And that is 5 Tribes, designed by Bruna Cathala and published by Days of Wonder Games. This is a Mancala style game where the board is comprised of these modular tiles that you use to create a board, a 6x5 grid. And basically all these spots are pre-populated with 3 different randomly placed colored meeples. And you're moving these meeples along the way. And every time you move the meeples, the amount of meeples you grab determine how many spaces you can move. And you have to drop one of those meeples on each space that you move along the way, finally culminating in a spot that has at least 1 meeple that matches the color of that last meeple you're dropping. And if you do, you collect those meeples, and all the different colored meeples give you different benefits depending on their color. And you will activate a specific power within that tile triggers. So it's kind of like worker placement when you really think about it. And the different powers allow you to accrue resource cards, which can be used for victory points. They allow you to accrue coins, which the coins grant you lots of abilities throughout the game, especially the auctioning, because at the beginning of each round, you're participating in an auction for turn order. But also the coins are points in the end of the game. This is definitely a point salad style game. There's so many different ways of scoring points. Also, if you're ever able to unoccupy a tile completely with your move, then you will place one of your camels there, designating that you control that area. So there's a little bit of area control as far as that's concerned. And the tile, each tile has an intrinsic value as far as victory points is concerned. If that tile has your camel on it, you're going to score that many points at the end of the game. This game just has so many cool, neat mechanisms that are all combined in such a neat, seamless fashion that just makes you say, well, why isn't every game like this, really? Like, you know, the idea of combining so many things and at the same time it not feeling heavy, it's still feeling rather intuitive, albeit a little bit prone to AP or analysis paralysis, because early on in the game especially, there are so many options and opportunities as far as the decisions you can make. But the thing about this game that made it climb up so high in my list this year, because it was already really high, number 6. How come it climbed up even higher to number 3? Is because I introduced it to my wife Lily this past year. And previously I had not been playing this particular game with Lily, but I had a pretty good inkling that she would like this game, and she has liked this game. And something about that, having an additional person to play with, and in particular being my wife and my life partner, has enhanced my enjoyment of this game, and that's why it's climbed up to my number 3 board game of all time, 5 Tribes. And now we move on to my number 2. And my number 2 was also number 2 last year, so it has not changed. Love this game a lot. And that is Marvel Legendary. And this right here is my Dark City expansion box, which is one of my favorite expansions. I actually have my base box under a bunch of other heavier boxes, and I decided not to pull it out. But I have a bunch of content in this here as well. There's so much content for this game. This is a deck building game with the Marvel theme. And it is so cool because your board is not just a regular spot where you place cards that you could buy like in your typical deck building game, but it consists of a city divided into 5 different spaces that the villains from the villain deck are moving throughout and eventually escaping. And when they escape, they trigger certain bad things that happen to you. And each game has a different mastermind. It has a bunch of different villains that you could combine to make your villain deck. It also has a scheme, and the scheme is basically the plot or the objective that the bad guys are trying to accomplish. And it also tells you how you lose the game to the bad guys, or how you as the good guys might be able to win the game, and what you could do to prevent things along the way. It's so cool. There's so many different characters in this game. So if you are a Marvel buff, if you're a Marvel fan, it is such an enjoyable experience to just interact with all these different characters that you've always enjoyed from your childhood, from your adulthood, and just being able to see how their powers and what their cards are able to do correspond with one another, and how they match, and how well the creators of this game were able to identify these powers and implement them in gameplay fashion. Really cool, really neat. And again, just the variety from the schemes. There's so many different schemes, and that makes every single game that you play feel so radically different. The only way you could ever play the same game in Marvel Legendary is if you intend to, because again, between the masterminds, the villains, the heroes, and the schemes, there's so many different ways of playing this game. And I love how they use their game space to its fullest, right? Because all of these schemes interact with every aspect. They interact with the shield officer's deck, or they might interact with your wounds or your bystanders. Things that you thought were on the periphery of the game design, but that the designers and developers of this game have found a way to include them and highlight them in some of these particular schemes. So interesting, so innovative. And again, it's just such a meaty, crunchy experience. I love playing this solo. I love playing with other people. My number 2 board game of all time, Marvel Legendary. And now we move on to my number 1, the top game of all time. And this game was ranked number 1 on my list last year, and it's honestly been ranked number 1 for as long as I've been playing it, and some people wonder why. My number 1 is Cosmic Encounter, and this is designed by Jack Kittredge, Peter Olaka, and Bill Eberly, and this edition has Bill Norton as well from Fantasy Flight. games. This is the standard edition now. The definitive version of this game has been out for over 12 years in Fantasy Flight, but this game has been out for over 40 years since when it was first originally published by these group of designers. This is a science fiction themed negotiating game where players are each a special alien race that differentiates them and distinguishes them from all the other players on the table, and allows them to break certain rules or tweak certain rules to their advantage. And you have your own system of 5 planets with ships there, which represent your own colonies, but you're also trying to colonize in 5 foreign planets, right? And if you're able to do this, and sometimes you do this through warfare, through battle, and sometimes you do it through the diplomacy and through engaging in negotiation. If you're able to do this, you win the game. And the cool thing about this game is that multiple people could win at the same time. As a matter of fact, there only has to be one loser. So theoretically, everybody except for one can win the game. It's really cool because you're engaging in this negotiation, and there's so many opportunities for betrayal even. Players can go back on their word, they can straight up lie, they can sever alliances and ally themselves with other players in the second half of the game as opposed to who they were aligning themselves with in the first half of the game. And all these things create lots of tension, lots of heated discussion and moments, but at the same time, it also creates lots of laugh aloud moments, lots of OMG moments, lots of wow moments, and just manipulating the card play, because the conflict resolution is based on card play, numbered cards, and comparing them and adding, your forces or your ships that were participating in that battle, adding whatever potential support you might have from your allies, also maybe some reinforcement cards that you can throw in after the fact to add to your total, manipulating your hand in order to be efficient in your battle, and also knowing realistically, how can I win this game? Can I win this game with brute force? Does my hand and or alien race combine well enough in order for me to just bum rush my way to victory? Or do I need to be more tactful? Perhaps my hand is weak. Perhaps my player power might be helpful in certain situations. It might be a situational type of player power, but not necessarily overwhelming or intimidating one. So perhaps I want to be more tactful, more crafty in my approach, know who are the power players around the table and who I probably should choose to align myself with. Figuring all those things out is such a neat game. Fun negotiating game. Again, lots of people wonder why I like it so much. It is definitely an outlier as far as my list is concerned, mostly comprised of medium weight Euros with a little bit of Ameritrash sprinkled in here and there. And then I have this negotiation game from 40 years ago, and it's ranked number 1. Again, I can't explain it, but I have so much fun. I gotta go with my heart. This is my number 1 board game of all time, Cosmic Encounter. And that's it, folks. Those are the top 100. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below. Tell me what you think about my list. Also, consider clicking on one of these 4 videos on the screen. If YouTube is showing them to you, it's because they think there's a really good chance that you will like one of them. And check out the rest of the top 100. And in the description down below, check out my link to my Patreon so that you can find out how you can support this channel and be more involved with the behind the scenes process. Research and find a tier that works for you. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.